Whether you call it the SNES, SNES or SNES, the Super Nintendo is many a gamer's favourite childhood console. With games like Super Mario World, Super Metroid and Mario Kart being synonymous with the system, it had a fantastic library of games, but there are many games that never saw release, being cancelled at some point before hitting the shelves, the most well known of which probably being Star Fox 2, which recently saw a commercial release on the SNES Classic Mini. Join me as we take a look at 20 of those unreleased games. When making these videos I always try to avoid games that were released on other systems, but a few inevitably make their way onto the list, and Pinkie is one such game, having been released on the Amiga in 1995, but a port was in development for the Super Nintendo. Pinkie is your standard platformer in which you control the titular Pinkie on a mission to prevent the dinosaur extinction. I've no idea what Pinkie is supposed to be, but he looks like some sort of hairless rodent. Gameplay is somewhat frustrating and convoluted, requiring you to purchase certain items and upgrades before going back on yourself to use said items to complete a level. A prototype was released by Unseen64 in 2014, but has several debug options enabled. The SNES prototype differed substantially from the Amiga original, with a control scheme that is considerably more frustrating for a platform game, and Pinkie has a health bar as opposed to the Amiga's unnecessarily harsh one-hit deaths. Cancellation was probably due to two factors: with the planned 1995 release date, the console wasn't exactly young, and the calibre of Super Nintendo platformers at the time would have been tough competition. Killer Instinct 2 was an arcade fighter from Rare, released in 1996 after the positive reception of the first game at both the arcade and on the Super Nintendo. A console port wouldn't emerge until it featured in Killer Instinct Gold on the N64, but a Super Nintendo port was reportedly also developed. Despite allegedly being completed, it was never released. The first of two games on the list based on characters from Malibu Comics, Firearm was to star Alex Swan, a private investigator specialising in cases involving superhuman criminals. In 2010, a very primitive ROM emerged, but it's glitchy as fuck, with Swan levitating through one level and it's not possible to die. Firearm was to be an action platformer, and the graphics appear to be digitised, and there are several weapons at the player's disposal. It was previewed in the May 1994 issue of EGM, and judging by their description, the demo version they received was the same or at least very similar to this early ROM. Spellcraft Aspects of Valor was a 1992 strategy RPG for DOS, but a Super Nintendo port was planned, albeit different to the PC version. A playable beta exists, which is almost complete and is compatible with the SNES mouse, but actually plays better with a standard controller. First announced at CES in early 1992, Spellcraft was expected in 93, but was reportedly cancelled for not meeting quality standards. Mr. Tuff was in development by SCI and was to be published by Ocean sometime in 94 or 95. The player controls the titular Mr. Tuff, a demolition robot. After humans leave Earth to colonise another planet, the world is run by robots, and Mr. Tuff must save the planet from army robots intent on world domination. It's a platform game, although it contains several levels in which Mr. Tuff is on a hoverboard, which play like a side-scrolling shooter. Two playable ROMs exist which show that Mr. Tuff would have had gorgeous graphics, so it's a shame that the game never saw the light of day. I'm not sure why this was cancelled, but perhaps the aforementioned high standards of platformers on the console at the time caused Ocean to withdraw. Jelly Boy 2 was a planned sequel to Jerry Boy, known as Smart Ball in North America, from Game Freak, famed for developing these Pokemon games. And yes, it was actually called Jerry Boy, I'm not just being racist for comedic value. A platform game with similarities to its predecessor, Jelly Boy 2 is a platform game in which a wizard transforms the main character into a creature resembling a blob of jelly, not dissimilar in appearance to the blobs in Puyo Puyo. The game has a certain amount of complexity to it in that each level contains 5 stages, and the first 5 levels involve Jelly Boy saving his companions, who have also been turned into blobs. Characters have different abilities, and certain stages contain hidden rooms which must be discovered in order to unlock the true ending. It's quite the shame that Jelly Boy 2 was never released, as it looks stunning, but there's a playable ROM available if you're interested. Congo: The Secret of Zinj was to be a Super Nintendo game based on the 1995 film, which itself was based on a novel by Michael Crichton. Described by a staff member as a bad rip-off of Donkey Kong Country, Congo had similar pre-rendered graphics, but as is evident from the prototypes available, it contained levels with differing types of gameplay, including light gun style shooting, platforming and river rafting segments. The quality of both gameplay and graphics also differed between levels, some being vastly superior to others. It seems that Congo was rushed out, being developed to completion in a mere 5 months, but after playtesting the game, Viacom decided to scrap it. The underwhelming reception of the film also probably played a part. The cancellation was devastating to the development team, who had slaved away for those 5 months in order to complete the game. Beastball was a planned port of brutal sports football for various consoles, including the Super Nintendo. Although popular on the Amiga and DOS, the only console version of brutal sports football was on the Atari Jaguar. The footage on screen is of the Amiga version, as very little is known of the SNES port, but it was reported as heading to the console in a late 1993 issue of Nintendo Power. Dorque Imp was in development for the Super Nintendo by Swedish studio Norse. A platform game, it has pretty nice graphics if you can forgive the poor quality footage, and in 2011 a playable beta was released containing 3 levels. The player controls Dorque, a goblin-like creature who's accompanied by Imp, who's, well, obviously an imp. Imp can spit out objects to attack enemies, and can be used by Dorque to float upwards to reach higher platforms. From this beta we can see that Dorque Imp was abandoned mid-development for some reason. Planned for a '95 Super Nintendo release, Bobby's World was based on the cartoon of the same name. A platform game with some OK graphics, the game's plot revolves around Bobby daydreaming as he cleans his room, producing some rather fantastical locations and enemies. Bobby's World was finished entirely and a ROM is available, but for some reason it was never published. Yet another game featuring a blob with eyes, Mr. Bloopy is a puzzle platformer developed by Rare, in which the player can change Mr. Bloopy's colour in order to shoot out different coloured blocks which complete picture puzzles. A bizarre concept for a game indeed, and very little is known about it or why Rare didn't release it. Dream TR acquired a prototype of the game, which was eventually released on cart and is available at Pico Interactive. The second game based on Malibu Comics, Prime, was to be a Super Nintendo game based on the comic of the same name. In the comics, Prime is a 13-year-old boy who's transformed into a superhuman adult, which gives the unique perspective of a child's mind dealing with very mature issues. In appearance, Prime is very similar to Superman, but with some disgustingly oversized arm muscles. The game's a side-scrolling beat-em-up, with the usual moveset for the genre: punches, kicks, throws, usable weapons, and an explosive special move. The beta available online seems to be fairly complete, featuring 5 levels, but power-ups can't be picked up and there's no music. Not sure what happened to Prime leading up to its cancellation, but Marvel bought Malibu Comics in 1994, and the character Prime was pretty unknown to warrant the release of a console game. When Arnie, Stallone and Van Damme are busy, Steven Seagal is the final option. Yes, Steven Seagal: The Final Option was the actual name of a planned Super Nintendo game from Tech Magic, due for release in 1994. First shown at CES in 1993, the game was hyped considerably due to the Steven Seagal license, but suffered several delays, causing this buzz to fizzle out. The game features a digitised Steven Seagal who has hilarious moves similar to those you'd typically see in one of his films. Seagal can also throw knives and shoot guns if required. Gameplay is pretty slow and the moves are executed slowly, which just makes them funnier in my opinion. The death screens of enemies are also pretty funny, which just adds to the overall hilarity of this game. Not sure if this was cancelled due to the game's average at best gameplay or for some other reason, but it's certainly an interesting curio in the console's unreleased library. The Shadow was based on the 1994 film of the same name starring Alec Baldwin, which I'd never even heard of prior to researching for this video. A side-scrolling beat-em-up from Ocean, The Shadow looks great and it has sprites reminiscent of Final Fight. The game had 8 levels featuring many well-known New York landmarks such as Times Square, the Empire State Building and Chinatown, in which the Shadow takes on enemies using standard punches and kicks, and by using weapons and special moves like invisibility and a shield. There's also a driving level where the Shadow and his enemies are on motorbikes. It was probably cancelled due to the film making a box office loss, and it can't have been great because like I said I've never even heard of it. A shame, as it looks like it could have been a great addition to the SNES beat-em-up library. Perhaps one of the oddest premises for a game ever, Socks the Cat Rocks the Hill was based on Bill Clinton's cat Socks. Konami actually planned 2 different games based on Socks, this one and one for the Mega Drive, having purchased the license from the Socks fan club, with some of the profits going to charity. Set in Washington DC, the game sees Socks make his way through various platforming levels to warn the Clinton family of a stolen missile launch device. Enemies are comical versions of spies and politicians, and bosses are exaggerated versions of past US presidents. First shown at CES in 1993, Socks was delayed and then cancelled when Konami closed their US branch. A prototype has been bought and sold several times in recent years, and in 2016 a Kickstarter campaign to release the game was successfully funded. Boo was a platform game planned for the Super Nintendo, Mega Drive and Amiga, developed by Microprose. Reportedly 80% complete, Boo was previewed in the One Amiga in its February 1995 issue and was even the cover feature. The game featured artwork from the creator of Danger Mouse, Keith Scoble, and was about a teenage boy who dies and becomes a ghost. The game gets its name from the Boo shout attacks which he uses to defeat enemies. The only footage I could find was of a VHS recording, so apologies for the terrible quality. Boo was cancelled along with several other games in development due to Microprose suffering from some financial troubles at the time. Another bizarre premise for a game here, Christopher Columbus was a side-scrolling shooter planned for the Super Nintendo in 92-93 based on the Italian explorer. But thankfully, rather than slaughtering waves of defenceless Native Americans, in this game he's piloting a flying ship and shooting dragons and mythical sea creatures. Despite being allegedly complete, Christopher Columbus was cancelled. Fireteam Rogue is probably the most ambitious project on this list. Set for release between 94 and 96, and in development by Accolade, Fireteam Rogue promised over 100 hours of gameplay, chunky sprites, and a deep backstory. The game was planned for both the Super Nintendo and Sega's Genesis, and had a huge budget, a large portion of which was spent on marketing and promotional materials. Accolade planned to capitalise on the 90s comic book renaissance by creating a comic book introducing the game's plot, and would include a 15-page comic in the SNES manual, and also talked of a run of action figures and a spin-off television programme. The development process was riddled with issues, not the least of which being the huge focus on marketing and promotion, before a solid gameplay experience was in place. The sheer scale of the game's ambition also put a strain on development, with programmers struggling to simply fit everything into the levels. 2 prototypes exist of the game, the first emerging in 2006 and the second a few years later. The later prototype, although also unfinished, adds shooter levels which are from the same perspective as games like Afterburner, and a few other improvements such as a password feature and improved music. Ultimately, Fireteam Rogue's gameplay and level design didn't match the quality of its rich backstory, and various issues between the development team eventually led to its cancellation, despite the game being reportedly all but complete. Quik the Thunder Rabbit is a side-scrolling platformer released on the Amiga and Amiga CD32 in '94, but a SNES port was in the works, albeit a slightly different game. As you can see from this side-by-side comparison, the two are similar in essence, both having the same name and featuring the titular rabbit Quik. They do however have different graphical styles and levels, and the biggest difference is that the SNES version was to have levels beyond just platforming, with shooter and fighting segments. All in all, it's a reasonable platform game, and there's a playable prototype available. Another game based on a comic book character, Shadowhawk was to be an action platformer based on the comic of the same name by Image Comics. In the comics, Shadowhawk's on a mission for vengeance after contracting HIV during an attack. I know, right, dark as fuck for a video game. In the game, Shadowhawk leaps from platform to platform, fighting enemies and throwing shurikens, and using a grappling hook to ascend. During the end of level boss fights, gameplay switches to a rather shitty versus fighter setup, and all bosses are lifted from the original source material. Very little was known about the game until a prototype was sold in 2003, but it went to several different collectors over the years before the ROM was dumped relatively recently. The prototype seems to be of a complete game, although it's clearly unfinished, containing several glitches and unbalanced enemies. Shadowhawk was, I believe, funded by the comics creator, but they couldn't find a publisher willing to release it so late in the console's life cycle. So that was a look at 20 of the many unreleased Super Nintendo games. There are links in the description to sites where you can find ROMs for some of the games mentioned if you're interested in playing them. Let me know in the comments if any of them look particularly interesting to you, and as always, thanks for watching. If you're interested in seeing some more cancelled games, you can check out my playlist here featuring Mega Drive, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast and others.